Welcome to this video lecture discussing the critical role of collective bargaining for fair wages. The question of fair wages is at the heart of the debate on social justice. More than 100 years ago, in 1919, the Constitution of the International Labour Organization, the ILO, stated that universal and lasting peace can be established only if it is based upon social justice. The ILO Constitution also called for an improvement of working conditions, including the provision of an adequate living wage. Later, in 1944, the ILO Declaration of Philadelphia called for wage policies that ensure a just share of the fruits of progress to all and a minimum living wage to all employed and in need of such protection. Ronald Janssen, from the Trade Union Advisory Committee at the OECD, argues that for trade unions, fair wages have to pursue four broad objectives.
A first objective, I would like to stress, is that wages are to provide for a decent standard of living. If the market is left to its own devices, if there are no minimum wages or other sorts of mechanisms that put a downward floor to wages, then there will inevitably be employers who will be paying very or extremely low wages. So one definition that is often used for low wages is a wage that is 60% below the median wage, which is the wage in the middle of the distribution. And using this definition, we find that in flexible economies such as the US, the UK, but also Germany, around 1/4 of all workers, that is 1 in 4 workers, are in such a low wage job. Low wage jobs, in turn, may result in the phenomenon of the so-called working poor. In other words, we have workers who are part of a family that is living in poverty despite the workers are having a job. In the US, for example, 1 out of every 10 workers find themselves in this situation of being a working poor. Let's now talk about the second role wages have to play. Besides having decent wages, fair wages also matter. Simply paying a minimum wage, well, that's fine and good, but it's not good enough when companies, thanks to the efforts of workers and their skills, are able to increase productivity and record high profits. Workers also need to obtain their fair share in the overall progress of the economy. However, the fact is that over the past decades, wages have systematically been losing out if you compare it with productivity developments. And as a result, if real wages lag behind productivity, the share of labor income in the overall national income of many economies has gone down substantially, while at the same time the share of profits has increased. A third objective that wages need to take care of is the goal of security. If workers know their employer has the power to cut their wage overnight, they will feel very, very insecure. We know that for the typical household, wages are an important source of income, so that giving the employer the possibility or the flexibility to cut wages and to decide which wages he pays is not a good idea, as this will introduce radical uncertainty, and this uncertainty in turn will drive up savings and reduce demand in the economy. Let me come to a fourth role which wages have to play, and that is to function as an engine for economic growth. It's often said that labor is not a commodity. Indeed, if the price of a commodity like oil, for example, goes down, then the main effect is that profits go up. Wages, however, are not just a cost for employers. Wages also provide workers and their households with the purchasing power that is necessary to buy the goods and services the companies themselves are producing. So, if you depress wages, overall demand in the economy for goods and service will be weakened, and the end result may very well be that things are made worse and that even more jobs are being destroyed, as a result of having too low wages.
But what are the wage trends in the world? According to the ILO's Wage Report 2018-2019, in many low and middle income economies, wage inequality remains high and wages are frequently insufficient to cover the needs of workers and their families. The same report also points to the slow wage growth in high-income economies, only 9% over a period of 20 years. Overall, the report concludes that global wage growth has been weak, while the gender pay gap, at about 20% globally, remains unacceptably high. Neil Coleman argues that these imbalances are the result of various structural advantages held by employers.
Employers and corporations wield considerable economic power, while workers are largely dependent on selling their labor in order to survive. Workers are therefore often under structural pressure to accept whatever wage employers offer. Considerable unemployment rather than full employment is the reality of market economies in which investment and employment depend mainly on the profit expectations of private capital. Therefore, workers are constantly competing with other workers for an insufficient number of jobs. This tends to drive wages down and create unacceptable wage inequality. The dynamics of a competitive global market economy result in increasingly powerful corporations operating at a global scale, with monopolistic or oligopolistic leverage over important aspects of the economy. Their economic power, for example, in globally operating value chains, gives them multiple instruments for extracting wage concessions as a condition of investment, or reducing output and the demand for labor. The state, although the site of contestation between different social and political forces, reflects this economic power in society. Governments often create conditions that promote an environment skewed towards the needs of corporations. Capital mobility, liberalized trade and tax regimes, labor market deregulation, and legislation hostile to trade unions are examples of such policy interventions. Wages, profits, and taxes are distributed from the newly created value or income, which is generated through work in any society. After paying for wages and running costs, the remaining income constitutes the surplus or profit that goes to capital. The owners of capital are in a powerful position to influence the distribution of income in order to increase the profit shares. They wield the power of a potential investment strike if they don't get the high returns available elsewhere. This threat is a strong structural force against workers' demands for a larger share of the national income.
Non-economic factors such as gender, race, caste, and ethnicity have also an impact on wages and wage-setting practices, leading to what is commonly known as wage discrimination. Professor Archana Prasad discusses further the term wage discrimination.
Described in its simplest form, wage discrimination refers to the payment of different wages for the same work. By the same work, we mean that people with a similar educational and skill qualifications get differential wages because of their gender, caste, ethnicity, or race. This overt form of discrimination is non-legal in character and practiced both at the level of firms and at the level of labor markets in the case of informal labor. But quite apart from these, the concentration of historically deprived social groups in low-wage occupations shows that the setting of standards for fixing wages may also be mediated by social and political perceptions that do not strictly follow an economic logic.
To illustrate how wage discrimination works, let us hear from Professor Carlos Salas on the reasons behind differences in wages between men and women, known otherwise as the gender wage gap.
On average, men's and women's wages, measured by month of hours worked, differ, sometimes by 30% or more. And those differences exist even in developed countries. But what lies behind those numbers? The neoclassical answer is that the numbers reflect pure discrimination practices of the employers of women's low productivity levels due to the lack of skills. Thus, the differences are explained by the choice of the employers to discriminate or by the lack of training or job skills of women. But this explanation does not apply to all cases where there is a different payment level for men and women. Pure discrimination is penalized in most countries, and the general skill levels of men and women are very similar. So we need to find an explanation elsewhere. When we look at the distribution of men and women between occupations, we see a pattern of some occupations having a high share of women and others where men are the majority. This different distribution is called occupational segregation by gender. And a striking fact is that occupations where men and women are equally distributed are few. And in general, feminized occupations tend to have lower wages than masculinized ones. A closer look at these groups of occupations show that women tend to concentrate on those activities that are related to services or care activities. An example is the concentration of women in paid domestic work activities, while men are heavily represented in managerial occupations.
Having discussed some of the structural reasons and non-economic factors behind the concerning wage trends across the world, we turn now to institutions which are critical to reducing poverty, inequality, and wage discrimination. In this video lecture, we'll focus on collective bargaining. The ILO senior expert on labor relations, Susan Hayter, discusses how the collective bargaining institution addresses the key reasons and factors behind existing wage trends.
Negotiating wages through a union, or what we call collective bargaining, offers a voice to workers, compresses wage structures, reduces wage discrimination, and ensures that workers are able to negotiate a fair share of productivity gains. This can complement minimum wages. Furthermore, wages in unionized sectors on average, set through collective bargaining, are higher than non-unionized sectors. Levels of compliance are also likely to be higher because workers are aware of their wage entitlements, and both employers and unions are involved in monitoring the implementation of collective agreements.
Let us hear more from Susan Hayter about the definition of collective bargaining and its main characteristics.
Collective bargaining is a fundamental principle and right at work. It is a process that is defined by Article 2 of the Collective Bargaining Convention number 154 from 1981. Collective bargaining has 4 key characteristics that are covered by this definition. First, it is a process of negotiation. Emphasis is given to the free and voluntary nature of the process. In other words, free from interference by government or other actors. Second are the parties to these negotiations. These are an employer, multiple employers, or one or more employers' organizations on the one side and one or more trade unions on the other side. The emphasis here is on the need to respect the autonomy of the parties. Third are the subjects for collective bargaining. Topics for negotiation often include wages, hours of work, annual bonuses, annual leave, maternity leave, and occupational health and safety, among other things. But it can also include employment relations, such as the facilities for trade union representatives and procedures for consultation and information sharing. Fourth is the outcome of collective bargaining. This is a collective agreement entered into voluntarily and that binds the signatories to the agreement and those on whose behalf it was concluded. Emphasis here is given to a principle of favorability. What does that mean? A collective agreement replaces individual contracts of employment while at the same time recognizing any provisions that may be more favorable to workers. It's imperative that both parties bargain in good faith in order to produce the optimum results. Collective bargaining is sometimes described as a way of building trust, while others view it as structured antagonism. Collective bargaining can take place at different levels. single workplaces, the organisation or enterprise level, an occupational, sectoral or industry level, or at the regional or national level. So let's talk about these levels. Let's start with enterprise level bargaining. This takes place between a single employer or employer representative and a workers' organisation and trade union. The role of company level negotiations is to tailor-make wages and working conditions to the enterprise. This type of bargaining is dominant in the US, UK, Indonesia, the Philippines, Mexico, and in Tanzania in the private sector. Sectoral collective bargaining. Well, sectoral level bargaining takes place across an entire sector where employers negotiate together, either through multi-employer bargaining arrangement or an employers' organisation. Collective agreements reached are typically extended to cover all enterprises, unionised and non-unionised in the specific sector. Sectoral level bargaining is prevalent in countries like Austria, France, South Africa and Uruguay. Sectoral level bargaining sets a common standard for an entire sector or industry. It protects workers against competitive downward pressure on wages and ensures that no employer is placed at a disadvantage for participating in collective bargaining. Let's move on to national level bargaining. National level bargaining, similar to sectoral bargaining, typically sets a floor for wages and other working conditions. However, these agreements are intersectoral in scope in that they reach across different sectors. National level agreements can be used as a framework for bargaining at the sectoral or enterprise level, in other words, complemented by lower level agreements. For the International Labour Organization, collective bargaining should be possible at all levels.
Frank Hoffer discusses the critical importance of industry bargaining to limit wage competition and exploitative labour practices, but also to facilitate a more productive employment and structural transformations of the economy.
Employers, as a rule, have wage-setting power vis-à-vis individual workers. For individual employers, it is of course advantageous to get wages concessions from their workers. Workers, on the other hand, might feel that wage moderation is the only choice to keep their jobs. But such wage competition inevitably creates a downward spiral on wages. It sustains low wage, low productivity jobs instead of stimulating innovation and development. Fair and efficient competition means that all competitors should pay the same wage for the same work. However, as long as general wage agreements do not stop some employers to use their market power to lower wages, other employers can also not raise wages, and this would make them less competitive. Therefore, company-based collective bargaining offers only limited scope to improve the working conditions. Instead, setting the wage through an industry-wide collective bargaining agreement would make it impossible for individual employers to compete by lowering wages. It would also favor the most productive enterprises, as applying the same wage across the industry would ensure higher profit margins for more productive enterprises. Therefore, industry-wide bargaining speeds up the structural transformation towards more productive enterprises and economy. What is needed to achieve industry-wide bargaining? There's a need for trade unions, in particular in well-organized factories, to support solidarity wages policies for all workers in the sector. For employers, industry-wide bargaining can be of interest because it reduces the risk of industrial unrest and stops often ruinous competition. From a government perspective, industry-wide bargaining protects workers and supports the transition to more productive employment. However, less productive enterprises will fiercely resist such a move because it would put them out of business. Employers as a whole might also prefer the unregulated market, not so much for economic reasons, but because it increases their power as an employer vis-à-vis the individual worker. But from a societal and developmental point of view, industry-wide bargaining can help to create a more productive industry, allow for fairer wages, and is a strong barrier against exploitative labor practices.
Despite solid evidence of the positive role of collective bargaining in general, and industry bargaining in particular, there has been a weakening of collective bargaining systems in the last decades. The ILO's expert on labor relations discusses these trends by first introducing the indicators measuring the strength of collective bargaining systems.
There are two indicators of the strength of collective bargaining: trade union density and collective bargaining coverage. Let's start off with trade union density. Trade union density is the measure of union members, which is the total number of workers that belong to a trade union. Collective bargaining coverage, on the other hand, refers to the proportion of workers that are covered by one or more collective bargaining agreements. So what is the situation today, and what are the trends? Well, since the global financial crisis of 2008, we've witnessed a dramatic change in collective bargaining coverage. While collective bargaining coverage and trade union density rates tend to move together, this is not always the case. In a study conducted by the International Labour Organization of collective bargaining coverage rates of 60 different countries, we found that the two rates were not always aligned. Collective bargaining coverage rates across the globe vary significantly, from a mere 1 or 2% in Ethiopia, Malaysia and the Philippines to nearly 100% in Belgium and Uruguay. In countries like France, trade union density is low, but they've been able to maintain high collective bargaining coverage rates of nearly 100%. In other countries, trade union density exceeded collective bargaining coverage, like in Moldova, the Philippines, New Zealand, or Singapore. This can be attributed to a variety of reasons. First, measurement and reporting errors in union membership data. This is not a perfect science. Second, union membership may be highly concentrated in the public sector where methods other than collective bargaining are used, like public service consultation bodies. Third, unions may be focused on political lobbying and the administration of Social Security rather than collective bargaining. And fourth, there may be resistance from employers to trade unions, and unions may find it difficult to gain the majorities needed to be recognized for the purposes of collective bargaining. In 47 of the 60 countries we analyzed, coverage rates exceeded union density rates. There are 4 reasons in particular for this occurrence. First, employers may choose to apply the agreement to non-members. Second, employers in some countries, such as Brazil and Indonesia, have a legal obligation to apply the agreement to all employees. Third, employers may apply an agreement to all workers to deter them from joining a union. And finally, coverage rates exceed union density rates as an outcome of multi-employer bargaining arrangements and the extension of collective agreements. Collective bargaining, as discussed in the previous video, can take place at different levels, at the enterprise, sectoral, industry, occupational, regional or national level. Research conducted by the ILO showed that collective bargaining coverage rates are predicated on the level at which bargaining takes place. For instance, the average coverage rate for countries that are dominated by enterprise-level bargaining was 14%. Thus, under conditions of pure enterprise-level bargaining, bargaining coverage rates are not likely to exceed 25%. However, for countries dominated by multi-employer bargaining at the sectoral or national level, their average collective bargaining coverage for workers was around 76.8%. Finally, countries that are classified under a mixed model of bargaining, in other words, including both enterprise and multi-employer bargaining, have coverage rates that linger between the two models. Consequently, researchers illustrated that the decentralization of collective bargaining negatively affects coverage rates, as fewer employers, in particular in small, medium enterprises, are willing to recognize and negotiate with trade unions. Examples of this can be seen in the UK, New Zealand, Greece, Portugal, and Romania. Trends in collective bargaining display 3 patterns of change along 3 dimensions: increase, erosion, and decline. Countries in which collective bargaining coverage remained stable or increased are those that supported inclusive collective bargaining. They did so through a range of policy measures: an enabling legal framework that ensured respect for organizational rights and facilitated the effective recognition of unions and employers or employers' organizations for the purposes of collective bargaining. Other measures and policies that supported collective bargaining, such as the provision of information to the bargaining parties, the extension of collective agreements, and labor clauses in public contracts were also found.
The rising inequality and the intrinsic link between fair wages and social justice, as stated in the ILO Constitution, emphasize the need for public policies which strengthen the role of collective bargaining in general and industry bargaining in particular. Here, governments have an important role to play. They can support industry bargaining by introducing various measures. For example, they can facilitate the establishment of joint industry forums that bring together employers and trade unions to engage in social dialogue on issues and challenges facing the industry. They can also support the creation of ad hoc joint bargaining committees to negotiate or revise the provisions of branch agreements. Governments can also introduce measures which provide for the registration of joint multi-party bargaining councils upon the request of representative parties seeking to negotiate at the sector, industry, or branch level. Governments can also actively use measures mentioned earlier in this video, such as policy-based extension of an industry-level collective agreement to all employers and workers in the industry or branch of industry, and inclusion of labor clauses in public contracts. Finally, countries need to put in place public policies which strengthen the very foundations of collective bargaining: strong and representative trade unions and employers' organizations. We hope you enjoyed this video lecture. If you want to know more about issues of wages and collective bargaining, such as what does it mean to bargain in an inflationary context, or what forms does collective bargaining take in the informal economy, join our full online course, Fair Wages in a Global Economy.